Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we journey into the mind of Alice Cullen, the seer who watched futures collapse and reform with every decision, who witnessed disasters before they happened and carried the weight of preventing them in silence. She's the guardian of what might have been, the keeper of visions that almost changed everything, who saw the Twilight saga end in blood and fire and death countless times before steering it toward the futures where love prevailed over destruction. So, before you get cozy, I want to tell you something small and honest. I have this dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers before the month ends. If you've been enjoying these stories and you'd like to help me get there, subscribing would mean so much. Now, settle in and let Alice's visions carry you softly into rest. Alice Cullen's precognitive gift was not the simple fortune-telling that human mythology attributed to seers and oracles throughout history. Not the cryptic pronouncements delivered by veiled priestesses, or the vague predictions scrawled in dream journals by those who claimed psychic sensitivity, but possessed only wishful thinking and confirmation bias. Her visions were immediate and visceral and involuntary, arriving without warning or invitation, pulling her consciousness from the present moment into futures that had not yet occurred, but that might occur depending on decisions being made in real time by people she knew and strangers she would never meet. The subjective nature of time becoming fluid and negotiable inside her mind in ways that would drive a human consciousness to madness within hours of experiencing what Alice experienced every moment of her vampire existence. When a vision came to her, she did not simply see images like photographs or film clips projected onto some internal screen, did not experience the future as distant observer watching events unfold from safe remove. Instead, she was there, fully present in the moment that had not yet happened, her senses engaged completely with the vision's reality, smelling the blood or the forest or the rain, feeling the temperature and the texture of surfaces her future self might touch, hearing conversations with perfect clarity, including inflections and emotions that would not be spoken aloud for hours or days or weeks. The visions were immersive to the point of overwhelming. Alice's consciousness transported entirely into the possible future while her physical body remained in the present, her eyes glazing over with the particular unfocused stare that her family had learned to recognize immediately, her posture freezing mid-movement, as if someone had pressed pause on her existence while the future played out inside her mind. The duration of visions varied wildly and unpredictably, some lasting only seconds of real time, while showing her minutes or hours of future events, compressed and accelerated, others holding her captive for minutes while she experienced futures that would take days or weeks to actually unfold. The temporal mechanics of her gift refusing to follow consistent rules or patterns that would have made the experience more manageable or predictable. She might see a vision of tomorrow's weather that lasted 3 seconds, or she might be trapped in a vision of next month's crisis that held her frozen and absent for 5 full minutes, while Jasper held her hand and waited for her to return to the present, his empathic gift allowing him to feel her distress and confusion, and the peculiar disorientation that came from living simultaneously in multiple time streams that contradicted each other with every passing moment. The fundamental mechanics of Alice's precognition operated on the principle that futures were created by decisions rather than by destiny or fate, that the universe contained infinite potential timelines branching from every choice made by every conscious being capable of making choices, each decision point creating new futures that replace the previous futures in an endless cascade of possibility and probability. When someone made a decision, or even contemplated making a decision with sufficient commitment that it registered as likely rather than merely hypothetical, Alice's gift showed her the future that would result from that specific choice, the vision appearing with clarity proportional to the firmness of the decision and the proximity of the decision maker to Alice's awareness and attention. This meant that Alice did not see the future in singular definite terms, but rather in multiplicities and probabilities, her mind constantly processing dozens or hundreds of potential futures simultaneously, some bright and clear because they resulted from firm decisions made by determined individuals, others hazy and uncertain because they depended on choices not yet made or on the actions of people whose intentions remained fluid and changeable. She experienced reality as a tree of infinite branches where every moment contained countless possible next moments, each future valid and real until decisions collapsed the possibilities into single actualized timeline. The futures she saw constantly being created and destroyed and recreated as people changed their minds or made new choices that invalidated previous visions and generated entirely different outcomes. The background noise of her gift was constant and exhausting, a steady stream of trivial visions about meaningless futures that her conscious mind had learned to filter and ignore the way humans learn to tune out the sound of their own breathing or the feeling of clothing against their skin. She saw Jasper deciding to hunt in 30 minutes, saw Emmett choosing to watch television rather than going outside, saw Rosalie planning to work on her car after sunset. These mundane visions flickering through her awareness like static on a radio station, present but not demanding attention unless something about them suggested importance or danger that required her intervention, or at least her acknowledgement. But filtering the important visions from the trivial ones required constant vigilance and judgment, Alice's mind making split-second assessments about which futures mattered and which could be safely ignored, her criteria for importance shifting based on context and current circumstances, and her understanding of what threats her family faced in any given moment. A vision of Bella tripping over her own feet warranted no attention under normal circumstances because Bella's clumsiness was constant and rarely resulted in serious injury. But that same vision became critical if Alice saw Bella falling near a cliff edge or in front of a moving vehicle, the context transforming a meaningless stumble into a life-threatening disaster that required immediate warning or intervention. The mental burden of processing this constant influx of information was staggering. Alice's mind working continuously to sort and categorize and prioritize the visions flooding her consciousness every moment. Her vampire brain's enhanced processing power barely adequate to the task of managing the sheer volume of futures she witnessed. She saw not just her family's decisions, but the decisions of everyone in Forks and the surrounding area whose choices might impact the Cullens even tangentially. Saw the police chief deciding to drive down a particular road at a particular time, which meant Edward needed to avoid that route. Saw a teacher planning to ask questions that would reveal inconsistencies in the Cullens' fabricated histories, which meant someone needed to be absent from school that day. Saw 100 other small decisions that required small adjustments to maintain the family's careful facade of humanity. The physical manifestations of her visions were subtle but distinctive to those who knew her well. Alice's eyes losing focus and her body going very still. Her breathing pausing, though vampires did not require breath for survival. Her entire being concentrating on the future unfolding inside her mind while the present continued around her. Jasper could feel the emotional shift when a vision took as her. The sudden spike of concentration or fear or excitement depending on what she was seeing. His empathic connection to his wife allowing him to monitor her gift's activity, even when she could not immediately explain what she was witnessing. The others had learned to recognize the signs as well. The way Alice's hand would freeze mid-gesture or her sentence would stop half-finished. The particular quality of absence that indicated her consciousness had temporarily relocated to a future that had not yet arrived. Returning from visions was disorienting in ways Alice had never entirely adjusted to, despite decades of experiencing the gift. The sensation of being yanked backwards through time into a present that felt less real than the future she had just inhabited. Her memories of the vision remaining vivid and detailed, while the present moment seemed somehow muted and less substantial by comparison. She often needed a moment to reorient herself after particularly intense or lengthy visions, to remember where she actually was and what was actually happening, versus what might happen or what would happen if certain decisions were followed through to their logical conclusions. But the most frustrating aspect of Alice's gift was not its intensity or its constant demands on her attention, but rather its significant and unpredictable limitations. The blind spots and gaps in her sight that appeared without warning and left her helpless and ignorant in situations where her family most needed her guidance and her ability to see danger approaching before it arrived. She could not see werewolves or shapeshifters at all. The Quileute wolves existing in complete darkness as far as her precognitive gift was concerned. Their presence in her visions marked only by absence and blankness, where she should be able to see futures unfolding. When Jacob Black made a decision, it created no vision for Alice. When the wolf pack planned their patrol, she saw nothing. Their existence functioning as black holes in her sight that swallowed any futures they touched and left her navigating partially blind through situations where werewolf involvement created gaps she could not predict or prepare for. The werewolf blindness extended beyond the wolves themselves to anyone whose future depended significantly on werewolf decisions or actions. Alice's visions going dark or becoming unreliable whenever shapeshifters influenced outcomes in ways she could not perceive or anticipate. She might see Bella clearly right up until the moment Jacob decided to visit, at which point Bella's future became hazy and uncertain. because Alice could not see the wolf's choices or how those choices would affect Bella's decisions and timeline. This created dangerous situations where Alice believed she understood the future, only to have werewolf interference invalidate her visions entirely. Her confidence in her sight becoming liability when blind spots appeared in critical moments. She also could not see the futures of people who had not yet made firm decisions about their actions, whose intentions remained so fluid and uncommitted that no single timeline achieved enough probability to register in her visions. Spontaneous individuals whose choices emerged from impulse rather than planning were difficult for Alice to track, their futures constantly shifting and reforming as they changed their minds moment to moment. Her visions of their timelines fragmentary and unreliable, because the futures she saw kept being invalidated by new decisions made before the previous decisions could be acted upon. Hybrid creatures like Renesmee existed in a blind spot Alice had never encountered before the half-vampire child's conception. The combination of vampire and human creating something her gift could not perceive directly. Renesmee's future visible only through its effects on others around her. Alice seeing Bella and Edward and Jacob responding to the hybrid without ever actually seeing the child herself in her visions. This limitation created terrifying uncertainty during Bella's pregnancy, when Alice could not see whether the baby would survive or what it would become. Her gift showing her only Bella's death or Bella's transformation, without revealing the cause or the outcome of the pregnancy that was killing her best friend. The limitations of her gift extended to purely random events that depended on no one's decisions, weather patterns and natural disasters and mechanical failures that occurred through chance rather than through choice. Alice could not predict when it would rain or when an earthquake might strike, or when a car's engine would fail from normal wear rather than from sabotage or poor maintenance decisions. These futures existing outside the scope of her precognition, because they involved no conscious choices that could generate visions. This meant that despite her powerful gift, Alice remained vulnerable to bad luck and unfortunate timing. Her ability to protect her family limited by the fundamental nature of her sight, which responded to intention and decision rather than to pure probability. Living with this gift for decades had shaped Alice's personality in profound ways. Her natural optimism existing not despite the disasters she witnessed constantly but because of them. Her understanding that she saw terrible futures specifically, so she could prevent them creating a sense of purpose and agency that counterbalanced the horror of watching her loved ones die in vision after vision. She had learned to treat the worst possible futures as information rather than as prophecy, as warnings to be heeded rather than as inevitable outcomes to be mourned. Her gift transforming from curse into tool through deliberate reframing of what her visions meant and how she should respond to them. Her relationship with Jasper functioned as an essential anchor to present moment and present reality, his empathic gift providing stability and grounding when her consciousness threatened to lose itself entirely in the infinite futures branching from every decision. He could feel when she was overwhelmed by visions, when the weight of seeing too many terrible possibilities simultaneously was crushing her spirit and her hope. His ability to project calm and confidence, giving her emotional foundation from which to process the future she witnessed without being destroyed by their implications. They had developed unspoken communication over their decades together, Jasper learning to interpret the subtle shifts in Alice's emotions that indicated what kind of vision she was experiencing. Alice learning to trust Jasper's steady presence as a reminder that the present was real and the futures were merely possible. The isolation of her gift was something Alice rarely discussed with others. The fundamental loneliness of knowing things no one else could know and carrying burdens no one else could carry. Her visions creating distance between her and even those she loved most because she experienced time differently than they did, lived partially in futures they had not yet reached and might never reach. She watched her family make decisions in innocence and ignorance while she already knew the consequences of those choices, saw them walking toward disasters they could not perceive, her knowledge creating responsibility to protect them, but also creating exhaustion from constantly preventing catastrophes they would never know had threatened them. But despite the burden and the isolation, and the constant mental strain of processing infinite possibilities simultaneously, Alice had learned to find joy in her gift's more positive aspects, in the beautiful futures she sometimes glimpsed that gave her hope and direction, in the ability to see happiness approaching for people she loved and to guide them toward those better timelines. She saw Bella's transformation succeeding, saw Esme's childhood filled with love, saw her family safe and together in futures that made the present struggles worthwhile. These positive visions sustaining her through the darker moments when all she could see were paths leading to destruction and loss. The ballet studio in Phoenix existed in Alice's visions long before she ever stood in its actual physical space. The building with its wall of mirrors and its wooden floors and its wall of windows appearing in her sight the moment James made his decision to use Bella's mother as bait, the tracker's plan unfolding in Alice's mind with perfect clarity as he conceived it and committed to executing it. She saw Bella arriving alone, saw James waiting in the shadows, saw the confrontation that would follow. But what terrified Alice most in those initial visions was not what she could see happening, but rather what she saw might happen if any single element of their rescue attempt went even slightly wrong, if Edward's speed faltered for even seconds, or if traffic delayed them, or if James proved faster or more vicious than they anticipated. The vision that haunted Alice most from that terrible day in March of 2005 was the timeline where Edward arrived 30 seconds later than he actually did. 30 seconds that separated Bella's survival from her death and transformation into the kind of newborn vampire that would destroy everything the Cullens had built over decades of careful restraint and deliberate isolation from human society. In that alternate future, Alice watched James's teeth sink deep into Bella's throat, rather than merely her wrist. Watched the venom pump directly into her carotid artery where it would spread through her brain and heart within seconds. The transformation beginning immediately and violently, while James still held her dying body in his arms, and Edward was still blocks away running faster than he had ever run, but not fast enough to prevent the disaster already unfolding. She saw Bella's heart stutter and stop, saw her body go rigid with the venom's fire, saw James drop her corpse and flee through the windows, knowing that newborn vampires were dangerous even to experienced fighters, and that Edward's rage would make him doubly deadly when he arrived to find his mate murdered and transforming on the studio floor. The vision continued beyond James's escape. Alice's sight following the timeline forward through 3 agonizing days of Bella's transformation alone in the ballet studio, her screams echoing through the empty building while the fire rewrote her human cells into something immortal and indestructible. Her consciousness fragmenting under the pain and emerging on the 3rd day as newborn vampire with no memory of why she hurt or who she was or what she had become. The newborn Bella in that vision rose from the studio floor with red eyes and impossible strength, and a thirst so consuming it obliterated every other thought or feeling or memory she might have retained from her human existence. The monster inside her fully ascended and demanding blood with urgency that would not be denied or delayed. Alice saw her crash through the studio windows and into the Phoenix streets, saw her moving with newborn speed that made her invisible to human eyes until she was already on top of her victims, saw the carnage she created in the first hours of her vampire existence as she fed without restraint or control or any understanding that the screaming dying humans around her had been her own kind just days earlier. The vision showed Bella killing 17 people in her first night as vampire. The bodies left scattered across Phoenix's east side in a trail that even human police could follow easily. The news coverage immediate and sensational, with headlines screaming about serial killers and mass murderers and terrorist attacks. Alice watched the alternate timeline spiral toward inevitable disaster as Bella continued hunting through her second night, unaware that she was being tracked by Edward, who had finally picked up her scent and was following the destruction she was creating with growing horror and desperation. His attempts to reach her before she killed again, hampered by his own grief and shock at what his delay had cost her and cost the innocent humans she was slaughtering. When Edward finally caught up to newborn Bella in that terrible vision, the confrontation was everything Alice had feared it would be. Bella's newborn strength actually exceeding Edward's century of vampire existence, her instincts sharper and her reflexes faster because her transformation was so recent and her body had not yet begun the gradual weakening that came with age and the slow calcification of vampire tissues over decades. She fought him with animal ferocity, having no recognition of who he was or what he meant to her human self. Her only understanding that he was threatening her and trying to prevent her from feeding. His attempts to talk to her or reason with her or reach whatever remained of Bella Swan inside the monster, completely futile against her newborn single-minded focus on blood and survival. The vision showed Edward forced to choose between destroying Bella himself or allowing her rampage to continue until the Volturi heard about the exposure and came to eliminate the problem, along with everyone associated with it. Alice, watching through tears, as Edward made the only choice his love would allow and let Bella kill him, rather than raising his hand against her even to save human lives or protect his family. She saw Bella tear Edward apart with newborn strength, saw her feed on his venom-laced blood in confusion when it did not satisfy her thirst, saw her abandon his scattered remains and continue hunting while Alice and Jasper arrived too late to save either of them. That vision's timeline continued forward into even darker territory as the Volturi received reports of the exposure and the murders and dispatched a guard to Phoenix to clean up the disaster. Alice, seeing Jane and Alec and Dimitri arriving to find newborn Bella still hunting, and Edward's remains scattered across the alley where he had died, The execution was swift and brutal. Bella, given no trial or explanation before Jane's gift brought her to her knees in agony, and Alec's mist removed her senses entirely. Her destruction carried out efficiently, while Dimitri tracked down the rest of the Cullen family to deliver the Volturi's judgment about allowing such catastrophic exposure to occur under their watch. Alice saw Carlisle trying to explain and being dismissed, saw Esme pleading for mercy and being ignored, saw her family fractured and possibly destroyed because Edward had arrived 30 seconds too late to prevent James from killing Bella in a way that created the worst possible outcome for everyone involved. The vision showed futures branching from that central disaster that led to Volturi occupation of Fawkes or Cullen exile to remote territories where they could be monitored, or outright execution of the family members the Volturi deemed responsible for the exposure and the murders and the general chaos that newborn Bella had created. But the actual timeline unfolded differently because Edward did arrive in time, because Alice had pushed him to run faster than he thought possible, and because Jasper had driven above even vampire speed limits to get them to Phoenix before James could complete his revenge, their combined urgency collapsing the possible futures into the single narrow timeline where Edward crashed through the studio windows while Bella was still human and still savable. Alice's relief when reality matched her best-case vision, rather than the nightmares she'd been seeing, was so profound that she collapsed after the rescue was complete, Jasper holding her while she shook with the aftermath of watching Bella die 1,000 different ways in visions that had threatened to become reality with every second of delay. The van accident in the Fawkes High School parking lot existed in Alice's visions from the moment she woke that January morning and saw Tyler Crowley making the decision to drive to school. Despite the ice warnings and the dangerous road conditions, his teenage certainty that he could handle his van on slick pavement creating the vision of disaster that would unfold hours later. Alice saw him losing control in the parking lot, saw his van sliding sideways across the ice directly toward where Bella would be standing beside her truck, saw the impact that would crush Bella between Tyler's vehicle and her own truck's solid frame. The girl's death instantaneous and unavoidable by any normal human intervention. She watched this vision replay throughout the morning with increasing urgency as the timeline approached the critical moment, seeing Bella's funeral and Charlie's devastation and Edward's absolute shutdown of all emotion as he retreated into himself and refused to acknowledge his grief or his loss. The vision showed Edward leaving Fawkes within hours of Bella's death, his family unable to comfort him or reach him through the walls he built around his shattered heart, his disappearance into the wilderness somewhere in Alaska or Canada, where he could exist alone and unmonitored, and slowly allow himself to fade into the kind of half-life that vampires lived when they lost the will to continue their existence. Alice could not warn anyone about the vision without revealing her gift's existence to people beyond her immediate family, could not tell Bella to stay home or tell Tyler not to drive or tell the school to cancel classes, because explaining how she knew disaster would strike would expose the Cullens to exactly the kind of scrutiny they had spent decades avoiding. She was trapped by her own gift's utility and its limitations, forced to watch the futures unfold toward tragedy, while being unable to prevent it through any direct action or intervention that would not create worse problems than the disaster she was was trying to avoid. But Edward's love for Bella overrode his caution about exposure in the critical seconds when the van began sliding. His decision to save her life regardless of consequences, creating new visions that replaced the death timeline with survival timeline. Alice watching in real time as he moved faster than any human could perceive, and stopped Tyler's van with his bare hands, leaving dents in the metal that would require explanation later. The exposure risk was significant. Dozens of students witnessing Edward's impossible speed and strength, but Alice saw the futures branching from that moment and understood that confusion and disbelief would protect them more effectively than planning could have. Human minds refusing to accept what they had clearly seen, because accepting it would require abandoning their entire understanding of reality and physics. The vision of Bella's normal life without vampires haunted Alice in different ways than the death visions did. This alternate timeline showing Bella surviving the Port Angeles attack through luck or last-minute intervention, bypassing strangers but never encountering Edward again after he failed to track her to the dress shop district, where she had wandered alone and vulnerable. In this future, Bella finished high school in Forks and attended college somewhere unremarkable and married someone human and ordinary and lived 70 or 80 years of completely mundane existence, never knowing that vampires existed or that she had been intended for something extraordinary and eternal. Alice saw this Bella aging and diminishing and dying of natural causes, surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her, but who would never know the version of her that would have walked into immortality with courage and certainty. The human Bella's life marked by vague dissatisfaction and the sense that something essential was missing, even though she could never identify what that something might be. This timeline showed Edward watching from a distance occasionally over the decades, checking on Bella's safety and happiness from afar, but never approaching or revealing himself. His love expressed through absence and through ensuring that her normal human life remained free of supernatural danger, even if it also remained free of the passion and purpose she would have found in their relationship. The tragedy of this vision was not death or violence, but rather the quiet waste of potential unfulfilled. Bella living a safe, comfortable, meaningless life when she could have lived forever alongside someone who understood her completely and loved her absolutely. Alice grieved for this alternate Bella more than she grieved for the versions that died quickly, understanding that some losses were measured not in years stolen, but in years spent settling for less than what might have been, in choosing or being forced into safety over significance and comfort, over the kind of love that transformed everything it touched. The Port Angeles attack played out in Alice's visions with sickening detail in the hours before it actually occurred, her sight showing her Bella walking alone through darkening streets, while 4 drunk men made the decision to follow her and to hurt her in ways Alice could barely stand to witness even in vision form. She saw the assault beginning in an alley behind closed businesses, saw Bella fighting and screaming and being overpowered by superior numbers and strength, saw the violence escalating beyond assault into murder, as the men panicked about leaving witnesses who could identify them and testify against them. But Edward's instinctive decision to track Bella, despite his attempts to stay away from her, created new timelines that replaced the assault vision with rescue vision. Alice watching with relief as Edward's silver Volvo, appeared exactly when needed, and Bella escaped unharmed physically, if not emotionally. The futures that branched from Edward's intervention showed Bella and Edward's relationship deepening over dinner at the Italian restaurant, their connection solidifying into something that would survive James's hunt and Edward's abandonment and every other disaster that threatened to separate them. The Port Angeles rescue functioning as turning point, where Edward stopped pretending he could stay away from Bella and accepted that loving her was worth whatever dangers that love created. The vision of Bella's death hit Alice with the force of physical blow on a grey March afternoon in 2006 while she was arranging flowers in the Cullen house living room. Her consciousness yanked without warning into a future where Bella Swan jumped from the cliffs at La Push and did not surface from the churning water below. Alice saw the jump itself with perfect clarity. Bella standing at the edge of the highest cliff with rain falling and wind whipping her hair across her face, her expression suggesting desperation or determination or possibly both, her body leaning forward into empty air and then falling with arms spread wide like she was embracing the ocean rather than simply succumbing to it. The vision should have continued to show Bella's fate after hitting the water, should have revealed whether she drowned or swam to safety or was rescued by someone nearby. But instead, Alice's sight went completely black the moment Bella disappeared beneath the waves, the blankness absolute and impenetrable in ways that suggested death, rather than simply the end of a decision's consequences. She had experienced this kind of vision termination before, when the person she was tracking died and ceased making decisions that could generate futures. The blank void marking the end of that individual's timeline and the beginning of futures that did not include them. Alice's interpretation of the blankness as death was reasonable given her decades of experience with her gift and her understanding of how visions ended when people died. But what she could not have known was that the void in her sight was created not by Bella's death, but by Jacob Black's decision to dive in after her and pull her to safety, the werewolf's presence in Bella's future creating the blind spot that Alice's gift could never penetrate. The shapeshifter rescued Bella and brought her safely to shore, while Alice remained convinced that her best friend had just committed suicide by jumping into the Pacific Ocean during a storm. Her certainty about Bella's death absolute because her gift had never lied to her before and she had no reason to doubt its accuracy now. The grief hit Alice immediately and completely, her love for Bella genuine and deep. Despite their relatively brief friendship, the human girl having become essential to Alice's happiness in ways she had not fully recognized until the moment she believed Bella was gone forever. She made the decision to go to Forks within seconds of the vision ending. Her intention to comfort Charlie and help him through the immediate aftermath of losing his daughter, her own need to say goodbye to Bella and to be present for the funeral overwhelming her usual caution about involving herself too deeply in human grief and human rituals. She understood that appearing at Charlie's house would raise questions about how she had learned of Bella's death so quickly and why she had driven all the way from Alaska to attend the funeral of someone she had known for only a few months. But her grief overrode her usual careful consideration of appearances and potential exposure risks. The drive from Denali, where the Cullens had relocated after leaving Forks, took Alice most of a day, despite her vampire speed. the distance and the weather conspiring to slow her progress toward the small town where Bella had lived and died. She called Bella's house from the road to check on Charlie and to offer her condolences, her expectation that Charlie would answer the phone and confirm Bella's death. But instead she heard Jacob Black's young voice greeting her with suspicion and hostility that suggested the werewolf knew exactly who was calling and resented the intrusion. His tone was cold and unwelcoming in ways that went beyond simple rudeness. His dislike of vampires evident even through the brief phone exchange. Alice asked to speak with Charlie, and Jacob responded that Charlie was planning a funeral, his words confirming Alice's worst interpretation of her vision and solidifying her certainty that Bella had died in the ocean. What Alice could not hear was the context Jacob deliberately omitted, that Charlie was attending Harry Clearwater's funeral rather than Bella's, that Bella was alive and upstairs and temporarily unavailable because she was dealing with the aftermath of nearly drowning rather than actually drowning. Jacob's phrasing was technically accurate but misleading. His dislike of vampires and his desire to keep them away from Bella, creating the misunderstanding that would nearly cost Edward his existence. The werewolf understood exactly what he was doing when he chose those specific words, his manipulations subtle but deliberate. Alice arrived in Forks and went directly to Bella's house, where she found Bella alive and confused and completely unaware that her cliff diving had been interpreted as suicide attempt rather than reckless thrill-seeking. The girl's surprise at seeing Alice transforming quickly into joy at the reunion with her best friend. They were talking in Charlie's living room about the cliff diving and about why Bella would do something so dangerous when the phone rang. Jacob calling to check on Bella after the near-drowning incident, his protective concern making him forget his usual politeness when Charlie answered and mentioned that Bella was occupied with company. Alice's supernatural hearing picked up Jacob's entire side of the conversation, including his question about where Charlie had been when Bella was jumping off cliffs, the werewolf's tone suggesting judgment and disapproval that made Charlie defensive. But what caused Alice's expression to transform from confusion to absolute horror was not Jacob's criticism, but rather her sudden understanding of how Rosalie would interpret the phone call if she was listening to Edward describe Bella's cliff diving, how Edward's sister would conclude that Bella had died and would tell Edward that conclusion, how Edward would receive the news of Bella's death, and what decision he would make in response to that information. The vision slammed into Alice's consciousness with devastating clarity, showing her Edward's immediate choice to seek death from the Volturi the moment Rosalie told him that Bella had died jumping off a cliff in Forks. Alice saw him making travel arrangements and flying to Italy and arriving in Volterra with the single-minded determination of someone who had already decided that existence without Bella was not existence worth continuing. His plan forming with the terrible logic of someone who understood exactly how to force the Volturi's hand and compel them to grant him the death he could not give himself. His face in the vision was blank and empty, all emotion stripped away, leaving only mechanical purpose, his movements efficient and purposeful as he prepared for his final act. Edward's strategy was brutally simple and almost certain to succeed. His intention to expose himself to humans during the St. Marcus Day festival, when the plaza would be crowded with tourists celebrating the vampire hunting saint, whose feast day provided perfectly ironic context for actual vampires' public revelation. Alice saw him planning to walk into the sunlight in the middle of the plaza, where hundreds of witnesses would see his skin sparkle like diamonds, his supernatural nature becoming undeniable to so many observers that the Volturi would have no choice but to execute him for violating their most fundamental law about secrecy and exposure. He had chosen the festival specifically because the crowds would be largest and the sun would be at its peak intensity, maximizing the visibility of his exposure and eliminating any possibility that the Volturi could overlook or excuse his violation. The vision showed Aro's likely response to Edward's exposure. The ancient vampire's initial inclination toward execution, tempered by his fascination with Edward's mind-reading gift and his long-standing desire to add Edward to the Volturi Guard. Alice saw the futures branching between Edward's immediate death and his capture and forced recruitment. Both outcomes terrible, but the second somehow worse because it would mean Edward spending eternity serving the Volturi against his will. His gift used to enforce laws he disagreed with and to persecute vampires whose only crime was wanting to live differently than Aro's rigid structure demanded. She saw Aro's hand touching Edward's face, saw the ancient vampire's expression of delight as he absorbed every thought and memory Edward possessed, saw his decision crystallizing to keep this prize rather than destroy it. The timeline where Aro decided to keep Edward rather than kill him showed centuries of Edward's misery serving in the guard, his consciousness invaded constantly by Aro's touch and his thoughts monitored for any hint of rebellion or escape planning. His existence reduced to tool and weapon and prisoner with no hope of release or rescue because the Volturi's power was absolute and their reach extended across the entire vampire world. Alice saw Carlisle's attempts to negotiate Edward's freedom failing, saw Esme's grief aging her in ways vampires should not age, saw her family fractured and diminished by Edward's loss, even in the timelines where he survived his exposure attempt. She saw Edward's eyes going dead and empty as the decades passed, his spirit crushed under the weight of unwanted service and constant surveillance. But even the timeline where Edward died quickly was catastrophic for everyone who loved him. Alice's visions showing Carlisle's devastation at losing the son he had created and mentored and loved for nearly a century, showing Esme's retreat into herself and her inability to function normally after Edward's death, showing Emmett's rage and Rosalie's crushing guilt, and Jasper's struggle to manage everyone's grief while dealing with his own loss. The family would survive Edward's death, but would never recover from it, their dynamics permanently altered by the absence of the brother and son, who'd been central to their existence for so long. Alice saw Carlisle sitting alone in his study staring at nothing, saw Esme unable to work on her renovation projects because everything reminded her of Edward, saw the family dinners becoming silent affairs marked by the empty chair where Edward should have been sitting. Alice's panic as she processed these visions was absolute, her mind racing through options and timelines trying to find the path that led to Edward's survival, her gift showing her that she had hours rather than days to prevent his suicide. She pulled out her phone and called Edward's number repeatedly, getting no answer, because he had already discarded his phone knowing that his family would try to talk him out of his decision, his determination to die making him unreachable through normal communication channels and forcing Alice to pursue more desperate measures. she left the voicemails that grew increasingly frantic, begging him to call her back, to wait, to listen, knowing even as she spoke that he would never hear these messages because his phone was already at the bottom of some trash can or lying abandoned in his apartment. She called the Volturi directly, reaching one of the lower guard members who took her message but provided no useful information about whether Edward had already arrived or what his current status might be. The ancient coven's secretiveness making it impossible for Alice to determine how much time she actually had before Edward stepped into the sunlight and destroyed himself. The guard member's voice was courteous but completely unhelpful, offering no confirmation or denial of Edward's presence in Volterra, no timeline for when the festival would reach its peak, no opening for Alice to explain the urgency of her need to reach Edward before he made a terrible mistake. The vision of arriving in time versus arriving too late played out in Alice's mind simultaneously, both futures equally possible depending on factors she could barely control. The probabilities shifting with every decision she made about transportation and route and speed. She saw herself and Bella racing through Volterra's ancient streets toward the plaza, where Edward would step into sunlight. Saw them arriving with seconds to spare, and Bella throwing herself at Edward to push him back into shadow. Saw the Volturi garden noticing the commotion and coming to investigate what had disrupted their festival. She saw the relief on Edward's face when he recognized Bella, saw his confusion and his joy, and his immediate horror at realizing she was in Volterra and therefore in danger from the very vampires he had been trying to force into killing him. But she also saw the alternate future where they arrived 30 seconds too late, where Edward stepped into the sunlight before they could reach him, and his skin began sparkling in full view of hundreds of tourists who pulled out cameras and phones to document the impossible thing they were witnessing. In that timeline, the Volturi Guard moved with brutal efficiency to contain the exposure. Alice watching Felix and Dimitri dragging Edward underground, while Jane used her gift to incapacitate anyone who had filmed or photographed the sparkling vampire. The witnesses' phones and cameras destroyed, and their memories of the event becoming confused and unreliable under the combined influence of vampire speed and strategic crowd manipulation. The race to Italy happened in a blur of urgency and complicated logistics. Alice stealing a Porsche from the Florence airport because commercial transportation was too slow and too unreliable when every minute mattered, and Edward's timeline was collapsing toward his exposure attempt with terrifying speed. She drove through Tuscany at speeds that should have been impossible on roads designed centuries before automobiles existed. Her vampire reflexes the only thing preventing fatal crashes as she navigated hairpin turns and narrow village streets, with Bella beside her gripping the door handle and trying not to think about dying in a car accident before they could save Edward from the Volturi. The Porsche's engine screamed in protest at the speeds Alice was demanding. The vehicle never designed for the kind of punishment she was inflicting as she pushed it far beyond its normal capabilities. The vision of their arrival kept shifting based on traffic and timing. Alice, watching possible futures flicker between success and failure, her foot pressing harder on the accelerator every time she saw a timeline where they arrived too late. She saw Bella running through the festival crowd in her human body struggling to match Alice's supernatural speed. saw her breaking through the barrier of red-robed tourists to reach Edward just as he moved toward the sunlight, saw her collision with him, pushing him back into the shadows, while the crowd around them continued celebrating without noticing the supernatural drama playing out in their midst. The timing was so precise that Alice could see individual seconds mattering, could see how a traffic light or a slow pedestrian or a moment's hesitation could mean the difference between Edward's survival and his destruction. The moment when reality matched Alice's best case vision and Bella actually reached Edward in time was one of profound relief mixed with new terror, because now they were in Volterra, having prevented Edward's exposure, but facing the Volturi's inevitable questions about why they were there and what they knew about Edward's intentions. Alice saw the futures branching from this moment, most of them leading underground to the throne room where Ara would touch Edward's hand and learn everything about Bella and about their relationship and about the human girl who knew too much about vampire existence. She saw the danger they were all in now, saw how close they had come to saving Edward, only to deliver him and Bella both into Volturi custody, saw the narrow paths forward that might allow them all to leave Volterra alive and free. Alice's vision of Bella's 18th birthday party had been beautiful and peaceful in the weeks leading up to September 13th of 2005. Her sight showing her Bella opening presents in the Cullen house, surrounded by family who loved her, the celebration modest but meaningful, the evening ending with Bella more integrated into their world and more certain of her future as one of them. Alice had seen the paper cut coming, had watched in her visions as Bella sliced her finger on the wrapping paper and a single drop of blood welled up and fell. But in those early visions, she had also seen Jasper maintaining his control, had watched him tense and struggle, but ultimately master his thirst through decades of practice and discipline, the moment passing without incident, and the party continuing toward its intended peaceful conclusion. What Alice had not seen clearly enough, or had chosen to interpret optimistically, was the fragility of Jasper's control on that particular evening, his newborn-like struggle with human blood made worse by being in enclosed space with a bleeding human, the scent concentrated and inescapable, rather than diluted by outdoor air or distance. Her visions had shown her both possibilities, the timeline where Jasper held firm, and the timeline where he lost control completely. But Alice's optimism and her desire to celebrate Bella's birthday and welcome her properly into the family had led her to focus on the better vision and to dismiss the worse one as unlikely outcome that her presence and Jasper's awareness would prevent from manifesting. But when the paper cut actually happened and Bella's blood scented the air, Alice's visions shifted violently to show her the terrible future unfolding in real time. Jasper's decision to attack crystallizing in the split second before he actually lunged, her gift giving her just enough warning to see what was about to happen, but not enough time to prevent it or to position herself between Jasper and Bella before her husband's newborn instincts overrode his conscious control. She saw the attack and saw Edward's response and saw the futures branching wildly from this moment, most of them ending in tragedy that would destroy her family as thoroughly as any external threat ever could. The vision Alice saw in the seconds during Jasper's attack showed the timeline where Emmett's intervention came half a second too late, where Jasper's teeth sank into Bella's throat before anyone could pull him away, where the venom pumped into Bella's bloodstream while her heart still beat and spread the transformation fire through her body before Edward could extract it or reverse the damage. Alice watched this alternate future unfold with horrible clarity while her physical body was still moving to help restrain Jasper. Her consciousness split between the present moment where Bella might still be saved and the possible future where Bella died from Jasper's venom, and Jasper died from his own guilt and grief over killing the girl his brother loved. In that terrible vision, Jasper released Bella's body the moment he realized what he had done. His consciousness returning from the blood haze to find Bella dying on the floor with his venom burning through her veins, Edward screaming and Carlisle trying desperately to stop the transformation, while knowing it was already too late. Alice saw Jasper fleeing into the forest in absolute despair, saw him running until he reached some remote location where he could destroy himself far from his family, saw him tearing himself apart with his own hands because he could not live with what he had done and could not face Alice or Edward or anyone else after murdering Bella through his failure to control his most basic vampire instinct. The vision continued to show Edward's response in that timeline, his rage and grief making him hunt Jasper through the wilderness with intent to destroy his brother for killing Bella. Their confrontation brutal and final, with Edward's century of restraint shattered completely by loss and betrayal. Alice saw herself trying to stop Edward and failing, saw Emmett and Carlisle arriving too late to prevent Edward from scattering Jasper's remains across some lonely mountainside, saw her family fractured beyond any possibility of repair by the murder and the revenge killing and the guilt that would haunt all of them for centuries after that birthday party went so catastrophically wrong. She saw in excruciating detail the aftermath of that failed timeline, Carlisle's devastation at losing 2 sons in a single night through violence that could have been prevented if only they had been more careful or more aware of the danger. Esme's retreat into catatonic grief that even vampire resilience could not heal. Rosalie's bitter satisfaction that Bella's presence had finally destroyed the family exactly as she had always predicted, mixed with genuine horror at the specific mechanism of that destruction. Alice saw herself alone without Jasper, the anchor of her existence gone, her gift showing her nothing but empty futures where she wandered without purpose or direction because the person who had given her life meaning had destroyed himself over a mistake that lasted seconds, but whose consequences would echo through eternity. But the actual intervention succeeded where the vision showed it failing. Emmett and Carlisle pulling Jasper away before his teeth could break Bella's skin. Edward throwing Bella backward with force meant to save her life, but that sent her crashing into the table where glass shattered and cut her arm deeply, the increased blood making the situation worse, but at least keeping Jasper from directly causing Bella's transformation or death. Alice's relief when reality diverged from her worst vision was profound but short-lived, because she immediately began seeing new terrible futures branching from Edward's decision in the aftermath of the attack. His choice to leave, Bella for her own safety, creating timelines that led to Bella's depression and near death, and eventually to Edward's suicide attempt in Volterra. The birthday party that should have been celebration became the catalyst for months of suffering. Alice's vision of peaceful integration into the family replaced by the reality of Edward's abandonment, and Bella's descent into despair, and all the cascading disasters that followed from that single moment of lost control. She had pushed for the party despite her vision showing danger because she had believed the good outcome was more likely, her optimism overriding her caution in ways she would regret for months afterward as she watched the consequences unfold exactly as her darkest visions had predicted, even if the specific mechanism differed from what she had originally seen. The guilt Alice carried about the birthday party was substantial and persistent. Her understanding that her desire to celebrate had directly contributed to Edward's decision to leave, and all the suffering that followed, making her question her judgment about when to act on her visions and when to exercise greater caution despite what her gift showed her. Victoria's revenge consumed Alice's visions throughout the winter and spring of 2006. The red-haired vampire's determination to kill Bella in retaliation for James's death, creating hundreds of possible futures, where Victoria succeeded in reaching her target despite the Cullens' protection and the Wolfpack's territorial defense. Alice saw Victoria building her newborn army in Seattle, saw her strategy of overwhelming the Cullens through superior numbers rather than attempting stealth or subtlety, saw the many ways the coming battle could unfold depending on decisions that had not yet been made and alliances that had not yet been formed. The vision that terrified Alice most during this period showed Victoria reaching Bella's campsite on the mountain, while Edward was distracted fighting Riley, the male vampire Victoria had created and manipulated into serving as her lieutenant and distraction. In this timeline, Riley succeeded in drawing Edward away from Bella's tent for just long enough for Victoria to slip past Seth Clearwater's defense. The young wolf, brave but inexperienced, and no match for Victoria's centuries of survival instinct, and her single-minded focus on destroying the girl who had caused her mate's death. Alice watched this vision replay obsessively in the weeks before the actual battle, seeing Victoria tear into the tent where Bella waited helpless and human. Seeing Edward return seconds too late to prevent Victoria's teeth from sinking into Bella's throat. Seeing Victoria's satisfaction as she realized she had succeeded in her revenge, even knowing that Edward would destroy her moments later. The vision showed Edward killing Victoria with brutal efficiency after she had already delivered the fatal bite, his rage making him savage in ways Alice had never witnessed before, his destruction of Victoria so complete that nothing remained of the red-haired vampire except memories and the venom already burning through Bella's bloodstream. But what made this vision particularly horrifying was not Bella's death, but rather what came after. Victoria's cruelty expressed through her decision to transform Bella, rather than simply killing her outright. The revenge more complete if Edward had to watch his love become newborn vampire filled with pain and bloodthirst, and no memory of their relationship or her human life. Alice saw newborn Bella waking 3 days later with red eyes and inhuman strength, and absolutely no recognition of Edward or anyone else. Saw her attacking Edward when he tried to approach her. Saw the family's desperate attempts to teach her control, while she fought them with newborn ferocity that made Jasper's decades-old skills seem inadequate to the challenge of restraining her. The vision showed newborn Bella's mind functioning on pure instinct, her human memories and personality buried so deeply under the transformation's violence and the overwhelming thirst that she might as well have been a completely different person. Her love for Edward erased or inaccessible behind the newborn's single-minded focus on blood and survival. Alice saw Edward trying desperately to reach Bella through the newborn haze, speaking to her about their relationship and their plans and their love. His words having no effect whatsoever on the creature that wore Bella's face, but did not remember being Bella Swan, or loving Edward Cullen, or wanting to become vampire under control circumstances rather than through enemies' vengeful bite. The alternate vision where Victoria succeeded showed Bella as newborn under no one's guidance or protection, her transformation happening on a mountain without the Cullens' careful supervision, her first feeding frenzy occurring wherever she happened to be, when the 3 days of burning ended, and she woke to find herself changed into monster, with no understanding of what she had become or how to control the thirst consuming her. Alice saw the death toll from newborn Bella's rampage, saw the Volturi's inevitable response to such obvious exposure, saw her family destroyed for failing to prevent or contain the disaster that newborn Bella represented. The vision continued to show the Volturi arriving to find newborn Bella, feeding in some populated area, her kills messy and obvious and impossible to explain as anything except vampire attack. Jane and Alec dispatched to eliminate the problem and to punish the Cullens for allowing such catastrophic failure of control and supervision. Alice saw the execution happening swiftly, Bella destroyed before she even understood she was in danger. The Cullens blamed for Victoria's revenge and for failing to protect their human adequately. Aro's judgment delivered with regret, but absolute finality that the family had proven themselves unable to maintain the secrecy that vampire survival depended upon. These visions drove Alice's insistence on the mountain campsite strategy. Her understanding that keeping Bella far from the actual battlefield was essential not just for Bella's physical safety, but for preventing the specific timeline where Victoria succeeded in her revenge. She saw the futures where Bella remained in Forks during the battle, and Victoria found her there, saw the futures where Bella accompanied them to the clearing and became liability rather than asset, saw how every alternative plan led to higher probability of Victoria reaching her target and completing the revenge she had been planning since James's destruction. The vision of the actual battle outcome showed Victoria failing because Edward and Seth worked together to corner her, because Riley's distraction did not succeed in pulling Edward far enough away from Bella's tent, because Alice had seen this specific danger coming and had planned specifically to prevent it. But she also saw how close they came to the disaster timeline, saw the seconds and decisions that separated success from catastrophe, understood that Victoria's death was not inevitable, but rather the result of careful preparation informed by visions of what might go wrong if they were not perfectly positioned and perfectly coordinated in their defense. Alice had also seen the futures where Edward transformed Bella before the wedding, where his desire for her and his fear of losing her and his understanding that her humanity made her vulnerable overcame his old-fashioned values about proper sequence of intimacy and marriage and transformation. These visions showed Edward giving in to Bella's constant requests for immediate change, showed him biting her wrist or throat and injecting his venom while she was still 17 or barely 18, showed the transformation happening in his bedroom or in the meadow, or in any of a dozen other locations where privacy and urgency combined to override his usual careful restraint. What made Alice keep these visions to herself, rather than sharing them with Bella, or Edward, was her understanding of the futures that branched from early transformation. Specifically the futures where Bella never became pregnant with Esme, because she was already vampire when she and Edward finally consummated their relationship. Alice had begun seeing the hybrid child in her visions only after Bella became pregnant, the conception itself invisible to Alice's gift, but the effects visible through everyone around the growing baby. And looking backward from that knowledge, Alice understood that early transformation would have prevented Renesmee's existence entirely. The visions of Bella as newborn during wedding planning showed disaster after disaster, her control insufficient to be around human guests, her appearance changing too dramatically to explain to Charlie or Renee, her need to hunt interfering with every aspect of the elaborate celebration Alice had been planning. Alice saw the wedding postponed indefinitely or cancelled entirely, saw Charlie's confusion and hurt at being excluded from his daughter's major life event, saw Renee's suspicion that something was being hidden from her, saw all the careful human relationships that Bella valued being damaged or destroyed by premature transformation. She saw specific timelines where newborn Bella attended her own wedding and struggled not to attack the human guests, her red eyes requiring explanation that no one could provide convincingly, her changed appearance making Charlie suspicious and Renee alarmed, her stiff, controlled movements as she fought her thirst making everyone uncomfortable, even if they could not articulate exactly what was wrong. Alice saw these wedding futures collapsing into abbreviated ceremonies with minimal guests or elopements that left Charlie feeling abandoned and Renee feeling betrayed. The celebration that should have marked Bella's transition into married life, instead marked by absence and secrets, and the growing distance between Bella and her human family. But more than the practical problems, Alice understood instinctively that the timing mattered for reasons beyond simple convenience or social acceptability, that Bella needed to complete her human life properly before stepping into immortality, that the wedding and the honeymoon and the brief period of married human life served purposes Alice could see in her visions, even if she could not always articulate why those purposes mattered. She saw the futures where Bella transformed too soon and spent centuries with vague regrets about experiences she never had and choices she never made. Saw the difference between Bella, who chose transformation after living fully as human, and Bella, who was transformed before she was truly ready to leave humanity behind. The visions also showed Alice the Volturi's response to early transformation. Aro's suspicion that the Cullens had transformed Bella to avoid his ultimatum, rather than because she was genuinely ready for immortality. His increased surveillance and his growing distrust of Carlisle's assurances that the family could be trusted to follow Volturi law without constant oversight. Alice saw timelines where early transformation triggered Volturi visit to Fawkes years before the actual confrontation over Esme. Saw Aro using Bella's premature change as excuse to examine the Cullen family more closely and to position guard members nearby for permanent monitoring of their activities and their adherence to the laws about exposure and secrecy. Alice's visions of Bella's future went completely dark the moment conception occurred on Isle Esme. the sudden absolute blindness hitting Alice like losing one of her senses entirely. The girl who had been visible in her sight for years simply vanishing from every possible future, as if she had ceased to exist, or had made the decision to disappear so completely that no timeline contained her anymore. The darkness was not gradual or partial, but rather instant and total. Bella's presence in Alice's visions replaced by a blank void that extended forward through time as far as Alice could see. The absence profound and terrifying in ways that Alice struggled to articulate even to Jasper, who could feel her panic and confusion through his empathic gift, but could not understand the specific nature of what was causing her such distress. Alice had experienced blind spots before, had learned to navigate the werewolf-shaped holes in her sight, and to work around the limitations her gift imposed when shapeshifters influenced outcomes she was trying to predict. But this was different in fundamental ways that suggested something beyond simple werewolf interference was blocking her ability to see Bella's future. The blindness was too complete, too consistent, too unaffected by distance or time or any of the factors that usually determined how clearly Alice could see someone's decisions and their consequences. The void, where Bella should be suggesting either death or something so unprecedented that Alice's gift had no framework for processing it or displaying it. Her first assumption was that Bella had died somehow during the honeymoon, that some accident or Edward's loss of control during intimacy had killed the girl Alice considered her best friend. The blankness in her visions consistent with how people disappeared from her sight when they ceased making decisions because they had ceased existing. Alice tried repeatedly to see Edward's future during those first days of blindness, attempting to determine Bella's fate through observing Edward's reactions and choices. But Edward's decisions were too wrapped up in Bella's continued existence for Alice to get a clear picture of whether Bella was alive or dead or transformed or something else entirely. She spent hours sitting motionless in a room staring at nothing, while her mind raced through possibilities, each theory about Bella's disappearance from her visions more disturbing than the last. Her inability to determine what had happened, making her feel helpless in ways she had not experienced since her earliest days as vampire when her gift was still developing, and she had not yet learned to trust its accuracy or interpret its messages correctly. Jasper stayed close during this period, his presence steady and calming, even though he could not remove the anxiety that came from Alice's sudden blindness regarding someone she cared about deeply. The phone call from Edward came nearly 2 weeks after Alice's sight had gone dark, his voice tight with fear and confusion as he explained that something was wrong with Bella, that she was sick in ways that defied explanation, that Carlisle needed to examine her immediately, but they were still on the island and transportation would take time to arrange. Alice's relief that Bella was alive warred with her terror about what could be wrong. Her visions, still showing nothing when she tried to see Bella's future. The continued blindness suggesting that whatever was happening to Bella involved something Alice's gift could not perceive or predict. The family's reunion at the Cullen house happened with Bella looking pale and thin, and somehow fundamentally changed in ways that went beyond simple illness. Her body moving differently and her scent altered, and her entire presence suggesting something impossible was happening inside her even before Carlisle's examination revealed the pregnancy that should not have been possible between vampire and human. Alice's visions remained dark, even with Bella standing directly in front of her. The girl she could see, with her physical eyes completely absent from her precognitive sight. The disconnect between present reality and future possibility so profound that Alice felt physically ill, despite vampires not experiencing nausea or any other symptoms of physical distress under normal circumstances. Understanding gradually that Bella carried something impossible inside her body did not immediately explain the blindness to Alice, her gift having never encountered hybrid pregnancies before, and having no precedent for how such unprecedented situations might affect her ability to see futures. She tried to see Bella's death from the pregnancy, tried to see the birth, tried to see anything at all related to Bella's timeline, but every attempt resulted in the same frustrating void, the futures branching around Bella but never including her directly. Alice's sight showing her Edward's grief, or Rosalie's determination, or Carlisle's medical interventions, but never Bella herself making decisions or experiencing outcomes. The blindness extended to anything the hybrid baby directly influenced. Alice's visions going dark whenever she tried to see events that depended on the child's existence or survival. Her gift apparently treating the half-vampire creature as it treated werewolves, as something outside the normal rules of decision and consequence that governed how Alice's precognition functioned. She could see around the edges of the blind spot, could glimpse futures that involved people reacting to the baby without seeing the baby itself, could watch Edward and Rosalie and Carlisle making choices about medical care and protection without ever seeing the patient they were caring for or protecting. The visions of Bella's death in childbirth came through other people's decisions rather than through seeing Bella directly. Alice watching Edward plan Bella's transformation after the birth, watching Rosalie prepare to defend Bella's choice to continue the pregnancy, watching Carlisle research every possible medical intervention that might save Bella's life when the pregnancy inevitably tried to kill her. These second-hand visions showed Alice dozens of timelines where Bella died, where the baby grew too fast and too strong and broke Bella's spine or ruptured her organs or simply drained her completely, where Carlisle's preparations proved inadequate and Edward's venom failed to take hold quickly enough to save her. She saw the futures where Edward destroyed himself after Bella's death, saw him seeking the Volturi again, or simply walking into sunlight somewhere remote, where no ancient vampires would intervene to stop him or capture him for their guard. She saw Rosalie's guilt and Carlisle's grief and Esme's quiet devastation, saw her family fractured by Bella's death in ways that might never heal properly. The human girl having become so central to their existence that losing her would damage them all permanently and profoundly. The weight of seeing these terrible futures while being unable to see Bella herself or determine with any certainty which timeline would actually manifest was crushing. Alice's usual confidence in her gift's guidance replaced by uncertainty that left her feeling lost and useless. But Alice also began seeing flashes of Bella as vampire, brief glimpses of golden eyes and pale skin and controlled grace that suggested transformation succeeding. These visions appearing without context or clear timeline, but providing hope that at least one possible future existed, where Bella survived the pregnancy and emerged on the other side as immortal rather than as corpse. The visions of vampire Bella were fragmentary and inconsistent, sometimes showing her with the family and sometimes showing her absent, sometimes showing her happy, and sometimes showing her struggling with newborn instincts, but all of them showing her alive and changed and still present in the world, even if Alice could not see how she got from dying human to living vampire or what exactly happened during the transition. The presence of these vampire Bella visions became Alice's anchor during the terrible pregnancy, her proof that survival was possible even if the path to survival remained hidden from her sight. Her reason to support Bella's decision to continue the pregnancy despite the overwhelming probability of death that every medical assessment suggested was inevitable. When the family argued about whether Bella should be allowed to continue risking her life for the hybrid baby, Alice's vote was influenced heavily by these glimpses of vampire Bella in her future. Her certainty that transformation would succeed, giving her confidence to stand with Rosalie and Bella against Edward and Carlisle's more pessimistic assessments. The blind spot regarding the baby itself was absolute and unchanging. Alice never seeing the child directly in any vision, never glimpsing what it looked like or how it behaved, or what its future might contain. The hybrid existing in permanent darkness as far as Alice's precognitive gift was concerned. She could see people holding something, could see Edward and Bella and Rosalie cradling empty space in their arms in her visions, could see their reactions and their emotions regarding whatever they were holding. But the baby itself remained invisible and unknowable. Alice's gift apparently unable to process something that was half vampire and half human in ways that created completely new category of being that her sight had no framework for perceiving. The realization that she would never see this child, that Renesmee would always exist in blind spot no matter how important she became to the family or how much Alice loved her, was profoundly unsettling in ways Alice struggled to accept or adjust to. Her gift defined so much of who she was and how she related to the world that having a family member completely invisible to her sight felt like having a blind spot in her physical vision, a permanent hole in her awareness that she would need to navigate around constantly without ever being able to fill it or eliminate it through any amount of practice or adjustment. She grieved the loss of being able to see Renesmee's future, grieved the inability to protect the child the way she protected other family members by seeing dangers approaching before they arrived. But the blindness regarding Renesmee had silver lining. Alice discovered only after the birth occurred and the immediate crisis of Bella's transformation passed. The hybrid child's invisibility, meaning that Alice could not see her future and therefore could not see her death or her suffering or any of the terrible possibilities that Alice normally had to witness and worry about and try to prevent. Renesmee existed in permanent present tense as far as Alice was concerned. Each moment with her uncontaminated by knowledge of what might come next or what dangers might threaten her. The experience of living without foresight proving strangely liberating despite Alice's initial frustration with the limitation. She learned to appreciate the gift of not knowing with Renesmee, learned to exist in present moment with the hybrid child in ways she could not with other people whose futures constantly pressed into Alice's consciousness, whether she wanted to see them or not. Playing with Renesmee became meditation practice. Alice's mind forced to stay in the now, rather than drifting forward into possible futures. Her relationship with the child uniquely uncomplicated by the burden of foresight that coloured all her other interactions with people she loved. Jacob's imprint on Renesmee created sudden new futures in Alice's visions that appeared the moment the werewolf made his irrevocable supernatural choice to bond with the hybrid infant. His decision so firm and absolute that it generated visions despite Alice's usual blindness regarding shapeshifters and their choices. She saw Jacob's devotion, saw his protection, saw him growing alongside Renesmee through her accelerated childhood and into her eventual maturity, saw the werewolf's timeline completely rewritten by the imprint in ways that eliminated all the futures where he pined for Bella, or left the pack, or lived separate from the Cullens. The imprint solved problems Alice had been seeing in her visions for months. The futures where Jacob's unrequited love for Bella created permanent tension between the Cullens and the Quileute pack, replaced by futures where Jacob's bond to Renesmee made him family rather than threat, where the treaty between vampires and werewolves strengthened rather than fractured, where the alliance formed during the newborn battle became permanent arrangement rather than temporary cooperation born of mutual need. Alice had not anticipated the imprint, had not known it was possible for werewolves to bond with hybrid children, but watching the futures shift and improve as Jacob's decision rippled forward through time made her grateful for the unexpected development, even if she still could not see Renesmee herself in any of those improved timelines. The vision of Irina seeing Renesmee in the woods and misidentifying her as immortal child came to Alice weeks before it actually happened. The nomad vampire's decision to report what she believed she had witnessed to the Volturi creating cascade of terrible futures that dominated Alice's sight from the moment Irina made her choice. Alice saw the Volturi gathering their guard, saw them travelling to Forks with grim determination, saw the confrontation in the snowy meadow that would determine whether her family survived or was destroyed for the crime of creating something they had not actually created. The futures branching from Irina's decision were almost uniformly terrible, most of them ending in battle and death. Alice's visions showing her Carlisle torn apart, and Jasper destroyed, and Edward killed, protecting Bella and Renesmee. The family she loved scattered across the snow in pieces while the Volturi guard stood victorious over their remains. She saw these futures replay constantly in the weeks before the actual confrontation, her gift forcing her to watch her loved ones die again and again in slightly different configurations, but always with the same ultimate outcome of total destruction and Volturi dominance. She saw Caius's face twisted with satisfaction as he ordered the executions, saw Jane smile as she used her gift to bring Carlisle to his knees before Felix tore him apart, saw Alex Mist rolling across the battlefield, neutralizing their allies' gifts and leaving them helpless against the Volturi guard's superior numbers. The visions showed her Esme's death following immediately after Carlisle's, the gentle vampire offering no resistance once her mate was destroyed, her choice to die rather than continue without him creating timeline where both of Alice's parents were lost within seconds of each other. The decision to leave without explanation was the hardest choice Alice had made since becoming vampire. Her understanding that staying would allow Aro to read her intentions and her plans, making departure necessary, but her inability to explain to her family why she was abandoning them in their moment of greatest need, creating guilt that threatened to overwhelm her even as she recognized the strategic necessity. She saw the futures where she stayed, saw Arrow touching her hand in the meadow and absorbing every thought and memory and plan, saw him learning about Nahuel before Alice could produce the hybrid witness, saw the ancient vampire adjusting his strategy to account for Alice's knowledge and eliminating the single path forward that might save her family. The search for Nahuel happened in vision first and in reality second. Alice's gift showing her where to find the 150-year-old hybrid and his aunt Cullen before she ever left Forks. Her precognition guiding her directly to South America and to the specific location where the witnesses she needed could be found. She saw Nahuel's testimony before he gave it, saw how his existence as a mature, peaceful hybrid would undermine the Volturi's justification for destroying Renesmee, saw how his aunt's story about his childhood would prove that hybrid children were not the dangerous immortal children that Volturi law prohibited creating. Irina's decision to report what she believed she had witnessed to the Volturi appeared in Alice's visions the moment the nomad vampire's mind crystallized around her choice, the futures cascading forward from that single moment, showing Alice exactly how catastrophic a simple misunderstanding could become when filtered through the Volturi's absolute authority and their tendency to interpret ambiguity as guilt requiring immediate punishment. Alice saw Irina running through the forest toward Denali, saw her packing for the journey to Italy, saw her arriving at Volterra and requesting audience with the Ancient Ones, saw her describing what she had seen in the meadow near the Cullen house, a child who appeared immortal playing in the snow with a family who had presumably created her in violation of the most sacred law governing vampire existence. The vision showed Aro's immediate response to Irina's testimony, his decision to gather the guard and travel to Forks forming before Irina had even finished explaining what she had witnessed, his mind moving with the speed and efficiency of someone who had spent 3,000 years enforcing laws and punishing violations without hesitation or mercy. Alice saw the Volturi preparing for war rather than investigation, saw them assembling their most powerful guard members and their most useful witnesses, saw them planning not just to verify Irina's claim, but to destroy the Cullens for creating an immortal child, and to eliminate anyone who had witnessed the illegal creation or who might protest the execution of an entire coven for this violation. The futures branching from Irina's report were almost uniformly catastrophic, the timeline spreading forward from that decision like cracks in ice, each possible future showing variations on the same terrible theme of confrontation and destruction, and the end of everything Alice's family had built over decades of careful existence. She saw the Volturi arriving in Forks with the full guard assembled, saw Jane and Alec and Felix and Dimitri, and a dozen others approaching the Cullen house with grim determination, saw Aro's false courtesy as he asked to see the child and made his accusations and delivered his judgment before the family had opportunity to explain or defend themselves or present evidence that Renesmee was not what Irina had described. Alice watched the meadow confrontation play out in hundreds of variations in her visions during the weeks between Irina's decision and the actual arrival of the Volturi, each timeline showing slightly different configurations of who stood where and who spoke first and who moved to attack and who died in what order. But the vast majority of these visions ended the same way, with her family destroyed and the Volturi departing satisfied that justice had been served, and their laws had been upheld through violence that eliminated any possibility of the Cullens challenging their authority or surviving to contest their interpretation of events. The specific deaths Alice witnessed in her visions varied depending on how the confrontation unfolded, but certain outcomes appeared with such frequency that she began to understand them as nearly inevitable unless something dramatic changed the fundamental dynamics of the approaching conflict. She saw Carlisle die in almost every timeline. Arrow's decision to eliminate the Coven's leader first, ensuring that the family would fracture and lose coordination immediately. The ancient vampire's pragmatic cruelty, recognizing that killing Carlisle would demoralize the others and make the remaining executions easier to accomplish without significant resistance or coordinated counterattack. The vision of Carlisle's death was brutal and efficient. Arrow himself delivering the judgment and Felix performing the execution with practiced speed that suggested he had destroyed countless vampires over his centuries of service in the Guard. Carlisle's head separated from his body before Edward could even move to defend his father and creator, before Esme could scream her protest, before anyone in the Cullen family could process what was happening and organize any kind of response that might prevent or avenge the murder of their patriarch. Alice saw Esme's face in the moment after Carlisle died, saw her mother's expression transform from shock to absolute devastation to resignation, saw her stop fighting and allow the Guard to destroy her because existence without Carlisle was not existence she wanted to continue. Her suicide by vampire execution happening within seconds of her mate's death. Jasper's destruction followed in most timelines, his military experience and his combat skills making him priority target for the Volturi, who recognized that leaving him alive to organize resistance would make the remaining executions significantly more difficult and dangerous. Alice saw Jane using her gift to incapacitate Jasper, saw him fall to his knees screaming in agony from pain that existed only in his mind but felt absolutely real to his nervous system, saw Felix approaching while Jasper was helpless to defend himself, saw her husband torn apart while she watched, unable to intervene or save him, or do anything except witness his destruction and know that her own death would follow within moments. The vision of losing Jasper was the one that broke Alice's composure every time she saw it. Her love for him so profound and so essential to her existence that watching him die even in vision form created pain that felt physical, despite vampires not experiencing physical pain the way humans did. Her chest constricting and her breathing stopping, and her mind rejecting what her gift was showing her, even as she understood that the visions were accurate predictions of what would happen if nothing changed. And the Volturi arrived to find the family unprepared or unable to present adequate defense against the accusations Irina had made. Edward and Bella's deaths appeared in nearly every timeline as well, their determination to protect Renesmee making them willing to fight and die rather than surrender their daughter to the Volturi's judgment. Bella's shield protecting them temporarily from Jane and Alec's gifts, but ultimately proving inadequate against the overwhelming numbers and the physical strength of Guard members like Felix, who did not rely on supernatural abilities to destroy their targets. Alice saw Edward and Bella fighting together, saw them protecting Renesmee with their bodies, saw them dying together as they had always wanted to if death became necessary. their final moments spent defending the child they had created and refusing to regret her existence, even as that existence brought about their destruction. The witness vampires the Cullens had gathered to testify about Renesmee's nature died in many of the timelines as well, the Volturi viewing them as potential threats, who had seen too much and knew too much about Renesmee's existence and the Cullens' attempt to create legal defense against the immortal child accusation. Alice saw the nomads and the Irish coven and the Egyptians scattered across the snow alongside her family members, their decision to stand with the Cullens in the meadow becoming death sentence when the Volturi decided that eliminating witnesses was more practical than allowing them to spread stories about the confrontation or question whether the Volturi's justice had been appropriately applied in this situation. But Alice also saw the timelines where they fought back, where Bella's shield extended to protect their allies from Jane and Alec's gifts, where Benjamin split the earth beneath the Volturi guards' feet and created chaos in their ranks, where Zafrina blinded half the guard members and left them vulnerable to attacks they could not see coming, where Kate and Garrett worked together to destroy Jane despite her powerful gift, where the battle became actual contest rather than simple execution. These visions of fighting back were fewer than the visions of massacre, but they existed, and Alice studied them obsessively, trying to understand what factors created the conditions where resistance was possible and survival became achievable, rather than simply hopeful fantasy. The vision she saw most clearly and most consistently among the fighting back timelines showed the battle beginning when Aro gave the signal to attack, the guard moving forward with perfect coordination, while Bella's shield expanded to cover as many of their allies as possible, the invisible protection neutralizing Jane and Alec's gifts and forcing the Volturi to rely on physical combat where numbers still favored them, but where supernatural abilities could create enough chaos to level the battlefield somewhat. Alice watched Benjamin raise his hands and crack the earth, watch massive fissures open beneath the advancing guard members, watch vampires falling into the crevasses and struggling to climb back out while being attacked by Kate's electric gift, or Garrett's combat skills, or Emmett's raw strength. She saw Zafrina moving through the battle with her eyes closed, her gift of sensory illusion not requiring her to see her targets in order to blind them. The Volturi guard members suddenly unable to see anything except whatever peaceful scene Zafrina projected into their minds, their confusion and disorientation making them easy targets for the allied vampires who could still see perfectly and could destroy blinded opponents with relative safety. Alice saw Jane falling in several of these fighting timelines, saw Kate finally getting close enough to touch the sadistic guard member and send enough electricity through her body to immobilize her long enough for Garrett to remove her head, saw the satisfaction on Kate's face as she destroyed the vampire who had caused so much pain to so many victims over the centuries. But even in the timelines where the Cullens and their allies won the battle, the cost was devastating. Alice's visions showing her Carlisle dying even in victory, showing her witnesses destroyed, showing her family damaged and traumatized by the violence they had been forced to commit in self-defense, showing her the vampire world destabilized by the destruction of the Volturi and the sudden absence of the authority that had maintained order and enforced laws for 3,000 years. The futures that followed Volturi defeat were chaotic and uncertain. New power structures forming and collapsing. Territorial disputes erupting without central authority to mediate or suppress them. The entire vampire civilization potentially fracturing into regional conflicts that could expose their existence to humans through sheer scale of violence and inability to maintain secrecy during widespread warfare. Alice understood that showing Aro these battle visions might be the only way to prevent the battle from actually occurring. The ancient vampire's pragmatism and his instinct for self-preservation potentially overriding his commitment to enforcing the law about immortal children, if he could see clearly that attempting enforcement would result in his own death and the destruction of everything he had built over millennia. The vision she prepared to show Aro was carefully selected from all the possible battle timelines, chosen specifically to demonstrate both that the Volturi would lose if they attacked, and that losing would mean not just casualties among the Guard, but the complete destruction of the Volturi power structure and possibly Aro's own death. But finding the right vision to show was only part of Alice's strategy. The other essential component being the discovery of evidence that Renesmee was not an immortal child, and therefore the entire confrontation was based on Irina's misunderstanding, rather than on actual violation of Volturi law. The search for other hybrid children, or for historical evidence of their existence, consumed Alice's visions in the weeks before she made the decision to leave Forks. Her gift showing her fragments of information about human vampire hybrids that existed somewhere in South America. Showing her a vampire named Helen, who had witnessed her sister's death giving birth to hybrid child over a century ago. Showing her that the child had survived and grown to maturity and lived peacefully without creating any of the problems that immortal children created through their inability to control themselves or learn restraint. The vision of Noelle appeared in Alice's sight, like answer to prayer she had not known how to articulate. The 150-year-old hybrid existing as living proof that children like Renesmee were not dangerous immortal children, but rather were something entirely different that Volturi law had never addressed, because the Volturi had never encountered such beings before. Alice saw Noelle's testimony in her visions, heard him explain that he had been born rather than bitten, that he had grown to physical maturity over approximately 7 years and then stopped aging, that he possessed some vampire traits and some human traits, and that he had never posed threat to humans beyond what any vampire might pose through simple existence among humans who did not know what he was. The decision to leave Forks and search for Noelle without explaining her plan to her family was agonizing. Alice's understanding that Aro would read her intentions if she stayed making departure necessary, but also making her feel like she was abandoning her family when they needed her most desperately. She saw the futures where she stayed and tried to explain, saw Aro touching her hand in the meadow and absorbing every thought and plan and piece of evidence she had gathered, saw him adjusting his strategy once he knew what she knew, and eliminating the advantage that surprise and perfect timing would provide when she returned with Noelle at the critical moment. The journey to South America happened in compressed time, Alice moving with desperate speed to find Noelle and convince him to return with her to Forks, her visions guiding her to the exact location where he lived and showing her what arguments would persuade him to leave his isolated existence and testify before the Volturi about his nature and his history. She saw his initial reluctance and his eventual agreement, saw Huilin's determination to accompany her nephew and tell her sister's story and bear witness to the truth about hybrid children that might save Esme from the Volturi's misguided justice. The return to Forks required precise timing. Alice's visions showing her the exact moment when her arrival would have maximum impact, when the confrontation would be balanced on edge between war and peace, when Aro would be uncertain enough about the wisdom of attacking that new evidence and new testimony might tip his decision toward restraint rather than violence. She saw herself arriving too early in some timelines, saw Aro having too much time to process the new information and devise strategies to dismiss or discredit it, saw him deciding that eliminating the Cullens remained the safest course, regardless of what Nahuel's existence proved about hybrid children in general. She also saw timelines where she arrived too late, where the battle had already begun and blood had already been spilled, and the momentum toward total warfare had become unstoppable regardless of what evidence she presented. The Volturi's pride and their commitment to finishing what they had started overriding any practical considerations about whether Renesmee actually posed the threat they had assumed she posed. The window for successful intervention was measured in minutes rather than hours, Alice's gift showing her that being even slightly early or slightly late would result in outcomes dramatically different from the peace she was desperately trying to achieve. The vision she would show Aro needed to be devastating enough to frighten him into reconsidering his planned attack, but not so devastating that it provoked immediate assault before she could present Nahuel and his testimony, the balance delicate and the margin for error non-existent. Alice had watched Aro operate for decades, had observed his decision-making process through Edward's thoughts and through her own visions of futures where the ancient vampire made choices that affected her family, her understanding of his pragmatism and his survival instinct informing her strategy for convincing him that peace was in his best interest regardless of what the law technically demanded. And so Alice Cullen carried the weight of infinite futures, watching disasters unfold in her mind so she could prevent them in reality. The seer who navigated probability and possibility to find the narrow paths where her family survived the countless threats that sought to destroy them. She witnessed Bella's death 1,000 different ways and steered the timelines toward the single future where Bella lived forever. She saw her family torn apart in the snowy meadow and found the precise moment when testimony and vision could convince ancient vampires that peace served their interests better than war. Her gift was burden and salvation intertwined, the curse of seeing tragedy before it happened transformed into blessing through her determination to change what she saw, to collapse the terrible futures into nothing and guide reality toward the better timelines that existed as fragile possibilities until her intervention made them actual. The visions that almost changed everything remained with Alice as warnings and as victories, proof that catastrophe was always one decision away, but also proof that catastrophe could be prevented by someone willing to watch the darkness and choose the light. So rest now, gentle dreamers, knowing that in infinite futures, Alice saw them all, and in this moment, the one that matters all is well. Good night.